Thank you. Well, we still got, I guess we have a few people left. My name's Will Call, and I'm here to show that retired people actually do go to conferences. It's not just Dale. So the idea for this panel was to get a trader, transmission developers. We're going to look at opportunities and challenges in those areas, and this is sort of a coming out party for two very innovative projects, Power from the Prairie and the project called Sioux Green. And so excited for you to hear about those projects. When we talk about an idea as big as this, I know my first reaction was that this is going to take an act of Congress. And I think Jim Hecker kind of affirmed that today. It just may require something like that if we really go all the way with something as big as the macro grid. But the ideas are so compelling that, at least for me and several others that sort of organically decided to hold this conference, we think the idea needs to get exercised and thought about and understood widely, and to get people thinking about how you approach something like this. I have a brother-in-law who builds guitars, and I asked him one time, how do you build a guitar? And his answer was, if I was trying to answer that question, I wouldn't know how to start. And so we're really looking at how do you start. And this panel, I think, or I hope anyway, is going to be trying to get to the verb. You know, what kind of incremental steps can we take? Where are the opportunities? How can we approach this? So we have an interesting and diverse panel. Peter Ford is with Freepoint Commodities, and thanks very much to Freepoint for being a sponsor and helping us fund that economic development study. Peter's been around for a long time working on competitive generation projects for the last 20 years, which is about as long as we've had competitive generation projects. He's been involved with projects, HVDC projects out in New York, underwater projects, and so he's got some insight into business models and how those projects work. And I'll just leave it at that. Bob Smith is Vice President with TransCanyon, which is a partnership of Berkshire Hathaway and Pinnacle, which is associated with Arizona Public Service. Bob's got a couple of major projects that he's involved with out west. He's living and breathing in the Wild West, which is a different kind of market. That's right. Yep. Bob Schulte is the principal at Schulte Associates. A lot of experience, several decades, 4 to be exact, working with both IOUs and public power. In the past, he's been involved with in the development of coal and nuclear plants, and he tells me now he's involved in the development of transmission, renewable energy storage, to replace all the work that he completed 40 years ago. So we're anxious to hear about his project called Power from the Prairie. And then finally, Trey Ward will be our cleanup hitter. He's got a very interesting project, which is a HVDC underground project, sharing railroad right-of-way and connecting between MISO and the PJM market. He's got a very interesting business model, which I think is a key issue in terms of how any of this stuff goes forward. It's really a venture capital kind of business model, and there's economic drivers that will fund it, so that kind of takes care of the who pays for it part. So with that, we can get started, and we'll start with Peter.
This is on. Maybe I'll go without the microphone.
Testing.
I'm just afraid I'll be a little too loud with the microphone. So my name is Peter Ford. Thank you, Will, for the nice introduction. I started my career as a PERPA conventional gas combined cycle developer with a firm called O'Brien Environmental Energy, which was one of the early large PERPA developers in the East Coast, although we had a little bit of California footprint. Obviously, PERPA did take an act of Congress to get passed, and that really helped to transfer a lot of investment out of traditional regulated utility and into a more dynamic entrepreneurial investment cycle. Obviously, towards the end of the 90s, the utilities jumped into the lightly regulated, deregulated, we called it, but it wasn't really deregulated at all, generation market. We saw an overbuild coming into Enron, and then we saw a real opening of power trading markets that kind of came onto the back of the Enron bankruptcy. So I started as a developer with O'Brien. I was about 10 years at what was FPL Energy, now NextEra, and moved to Morgan Stanley's power trading group and joined Freepoint in 2014. So I've seen a lot of cycles in, I guess, what is hot or what is growing. And I think on the transmission side, you know, I have had two deep experiences on the Neptune cable and the Hudson cable, both developed by what is now called PowerBridge, a fellow by the name of Ed Stern. When I was at NextEra, we developed a large combined cycle project that had no home and went nearly bankrupt after Enron and sort of the overbuild and heat rate collapse in the East following Enron. But we did the first Seams sale of 750 megawatts of unforced capacity out of PJM and into the New York power pool. It was the first of its kind. It was very large. It required, again, not an act of Congress, but a public-private partnership. The Long Island Power Authority was our customer. And that transferred to a second project that we work with the New York Power Authority on, also with the same tenant that we would sell capacity out of PJM and into New York City. What ended up happening was they decided to stay naked on the energy and capacity side and just build the cable. Although I think Neptune has remained what I'll call in the money from inception, where both the value in the short term has been accretive to the Long Island Power Authority. I think in the case of Hudson, really the opposite has been true. And I think it speaks to a lot of the challenges that we've heard today about short to medium term planning and very long term planning, because I think at the end of the day, Michael Bloomberg's administration had to agree to swallow what was probably and what will probably be 10 years of losses associated with the purchase of long-term energy and capacity across Hudson in order to get the project built. And I think their decision was there was a lot of wood that had been chopped, there were a lot of permits that would expire, and I think, you know, they made a decision that is sort of a unique decision that places, you know, that states that also encompass their own ISO have, you know, greater authority to make. And I think it speaks to some of the challenges of these broader transmission projects that have lots of jurisdictions. So, you know, Hudson did get built and is operating now, although it had some technical difficulties. Hudson, different than Neptune, also both HVDC projects, but in the case of Neptune, you had a inverter station on the PJM side in New Jersey and an inverter station on Long Island, which is sort of classic HVDC. And in the case of Hudson, because the property was so valuable in Manhattan that they built two back-to-back HVDC inverter stations in New Jersey and had about 15 feet of DC interconnect. And the purpose there was, in order to transfer capacity from PJM into New York, you had to have that controllability. So the water actually, the cable actually under the Hudson River is an AC cable. But it doesn't flow AC, it flows DC because of the DC back-to-back inverter stations. So again, it speaks to a unique markets-driven technological approach that, you know, really was identified and executed because of a specific problem in Zone J in New York. So my other experience on the commercial side of large transmission build-out, and I don't think we've talked about it much today, but I think it is the best example of the kind of large-scale, ambitious projects in this country, has been the CREZ project in ERCOT. CREZ was envisioned at a time when ERCOT was a zonal market. A lot of wind was starting to be built in West Texas, which again I think is analogous to the broader renewable build-out that we're talking about as it relates to these projects. And what was happening was there was a socialization that really skewed the market, because West Texas was seeing the same price signals as Houston and Dallas, and therefore incentivizing all of this wind. Yet it wasn't until the nodal prices came that West Texas prices completely collapsed, and all of those wind farms that had been built and had merchant exposure, or in the case of Credit Suisse, the hedging counterparties who had the merchant exposure on the other side of some of the developers, lost hundreds of millions of dollars. And then CREZ really took off, because CREZ was going to be the solution to that West Texas negative basis. And I think what we've seen with CREZ is, on one hand, really positive signals, because it really has facilitated a second renaissance of renewable build in West Texas and the Panhandle. But again, what we're seeing already in ERCOT is that build out, those signals that have been fueled in great part by Section 29 by the PTC tax credits, have started to overwhelm CREZ. So CREZ looked like it was going to provide capacity to West Texas and the Panhandle and equalize prices across that wind-rich region for a generation. At least that was the original plan. And I think in the span of about 6 years, CREZ is already increasingly filled up, and we're seeing prices collapse again in the Panhandle of West Texas. So I think CREZ is a really interesting case study in it achieved the results that we wanted in terms of accessing renewable resources and bringing them to load centers. I think it was unique because ERCOT is both a state and a ISO region that sort of controls its own destiny, and I think having that kind of coordination across multiple jurisdictions would be difficult without an act of Congress, as has been said. That being said, I also think, there's a cautionary tale there, which is when you create investment that is socialized, and then a bulk of the economic benefits go to large industrial developers, and then that opportunity runs out. I mean, I think we've heard a lot about the trade-offs between distributed generation on the renewable side and sort of central planning or very large-scale utility-type generation, which I think speaks to wind and speaks to transmission. I think there is a case to be made, and I think Texas makes an interesting case that the lion's share of those economic benefits will go to the Berkshire Hathaways and the NextEras of the world, where when you see more distributed build-outs, you see economic benefits that are more local. Maybe they are societally more expensive, I think they are, but they are maybe closer to home in terms of the costs are being borne by the people who are also seeing the benefits. So I think, there's a lot of dynamic issues in play. We do a lot of renewable development in New England. New England is, when you look at it from a macro perspective, a terrible place to build solar, particularly distributed solar. However, it's also a place where the powers that be in the local governments and in the state governments are really pushing it. They're pushing it for economic development. They're pushing it for reasons that are not necessarily low cost of energy, but are for economic development, for independence, for local resiliency. So a lot of cross currents. I do think we should focus, and we're going to hear more about some real projects, we should really focus on those projects that address specific needs. I think Hydro-Quebec's project with Iberdrola, this New England green, what is it called? It's the New England Clean Energy Connect. I'm sorry, there's a lot of letters in that acronym. Is a great example of specific projects that cross seams, that solve problems, and that are in line with local priorities, for lack of a better word, where sometimes these very big solutions really have winners and losers, and I think those create difficult to actually get done and get financed. So it's been very interesting listening to all of the analysis, and I think the analysis is valuable, even if these projects don't get built, because it creates a baseline of which to think about things that we can do. So it's very important to study it, and to study it, even if it doesn't ultimately end up in a $30 billion build out of infrastructure. I don't know if I used my 10 minutes, but I did my best. Questions
great.
or?
We'll do questions at the end.
Okay.
And thank you.
Yeah, sure.
So, make sure this thing stays on. While Will's pulling up my presentation, I just want to thank Will for the introduction. Lloyd, Larry, thanks for having me at the symposium. And I want to express thanks to Aaron and Jim for all the great study work they've done. As Will has mentioned, my name is Bob Smith. I work for TransCanyon, which is a joint venture between Arizona Public Service's parent company, Pinnacle West, and Berkshire Hathaway Transmission. I was with APS for about 30 years before I transitioned to TransCanyon 4 years ago. And you could probably take a look at me and figure, well, college, 20, 21, 33 years, there's probably a gap there. Well, you'd be right. There was about 5 years before I got into the power industry where I sold drugs. And Lloyd knows the story. The good news is that it was with a license, so it was legal. I was a licensed pharmacist. The bad news is that you don't make any money at it that way. And people frequently ask me, what's the synergism between pharmacy and electrical power engineering? The best I can do is that both professions are interested in helping to manage congestion. So, sorry about that. Sorry about that. All right. Okay. So TransCanyon, a 50-50 joint venture between Berkshire Hathaway and Pinnacle West, is a independent transmission developer focused on the West. And it's a combination of competitive projects in the CAISO that we've been looking at for 8 years now, and then potential merchant transmission that would be motivated by wind developers in the wind resource areas, the rich wind resource area in New Mexico and Wyoming, trying to get to California. And we have a project, which I'll talk a little bit about here in a minute, that would not only do that, but it would also allow the excess solar in California to be moving north and east into the Rocky Mountain area and Wyoming. So we have the financial leverage of both companies, over $100 billion in assets, focused on all phases of development. So we're interested in going from a concept all the way through development, construction, and then long-term ownership and operation. Through our projects that we've developed at both APS and Pacific Core, I think we have a long history of being good environmental stewards in the way we execute projects, and we certainly understand the importance and the value of collaboration in development of transmission projects. And an example of that is about 2.5 years ago, we established a strategic alliance with Pacific Gas and Electric within California that we've committed to each other between TransCanyon and PG&E that we would work together on any projects that would emerge from the CAISO competitive process. So here is sort of the organization. You can see on the left, Arizona Public Service. Bright Canyon is the wholly owned affiliate we set up to house our 50% in TransCanyon. And then you have Berkshire Hathaway Energy Transmission. That's the other. Oh, thank you. Sorry about that. Now you can see it. That also, under Berkshire Hathaway Energy, has operating companies in the west of Pacific Core and NV Energy. TransCanyon And you can see our president, my boss, Jason Smith. I run the front end, so conceptual and planning development. And then there's a fellow in Salt Lake named Todd Jensen that works for Berkshire that would do the actual project delivery. So he would take over from the environmental permitting, engineering, and manage the actual construction of the projects. We have 4 board members, 2 each from Pinnacle and Berkshire, and we enjoy an opportunity to tap into 27 professionals at both APS and PacifiCorp to help us with project execution. And if Chairman Hecker were here today, if he were still here, I would tell him that HR did not allow me to vet this team for sissies, but I think I can tell you that if we have them, they do a good job of staying in the closet. So, really quickly, so this slide is to talk about some of our expertise in development, building, and owning, operating of transmission, and a lot of this is done either at APS or PacifiCorp, but there's a lot of transmission that we've developed. We're very active in WEC and all the regional planning processes, so WestConnect and NTTG. Have done a major construction of 10 projects the last 10 years, basically, and then you can see the infrastructure that APS and PacifiCorp own and operate. So that's kind of a background of who we are. I do want to talk about one project that we have that we're sponsoring. Thanks, Larry. And we started this project about 3 years ago. We refer to it as crosstie. And it's the blue hashed project that's sort of right here. And what this project does is it connects some planned development that PacifiCorp has for their gateway projects. And one of those projects comes from southeastern Wyoming down into central Utah, 500 kV. And then there's a 500 kV line that was recently built in Nevada connecting the Las Vegas area up into sort of central eastern Nevada. Our project would allow additional capacity from Nevada into Utah and open up the Rocky Mountain area, the Wasatch Front of Utah, and significant load in Wyoming for excess production of the solar overcapacity, the duck curve, as people refer to it, in California, and then also provide capacity for high capacity wind from Wyoming to move into southern Nevada and California. The project is a 213-mile, 500 kV AC transmission line. It's about a 2/3 of $1 billion transmission project, and it would have 1,500 megawatts of capacity. So you can see the various benefits: increased reliability throughout WEC, access for the high capacity wind going southeast, and then again for the excess solar up to the northwest. It would have significant increase of EIM benefits. We've talked about EIM here today, and by providing additional capacity between the NV Energy, CalISO, up into PacifiCorp, East, and Idaho Power, you have a lot of EIM benefit increases. And then if you actually got regionalization within the West, you would have even more benefits. So we've been working this project through the regional planning processes. We just recently submitted it as a interregional transmission project into NTTG, which is the planning group in the Northern Rocky Mountain area, WestConnect, which is the group mainly New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada, and then the CalISO for study as an interregional transmission project. Let me talk about that in the next slide. Yeah. So here's sort of the schedule. The little green checks are things we've already accomplished. We've entered the second phase of the interregional planning projects, and we've done significant work in the WEC rating process. To move forward and really commit millions of dollars to permitting work, right-of-way acquisition, and detailed engineering design, I think we're going to have a little more certainty on commercialization of the project, which would require probably either regionalization of the West to the point where you get some CalISO cost recovery here, or get an anchor tenant of a large wind farm in Wyoming that would take a long-term transmission service on the project. So that's cross-tie. We have a couple of other things we're working on, but this is the only thing that we've really gone public with at this point, apart from sponsoring and continuing to progress some projects in the CalISO process. So I just wanted to give you a few thoughts on Transgrid-X, the 2030 implementation, and Chairman Hecker had talked a little bit about the challenges at lunch today, but I wanted to focus on a couple of things. Thank you. I guess we're caught up here. So how would you recover the cost of this project? I guess, it could always be deemed as a national security solution, kind of like the wall, and build it that way. But I think it's more likely that one of the traditional ways of paying for transmission, either through RTO rates or through a transmission service, merchant transmission arrangement, are more likely. So on the Eastern Interconnect side, you have MISO and or SPP. I think most of the ties are actually into SPP, but certainly there would be benefits, I would assume, that would accrue to the MISO, and likely there are benefits that would accrue to PJM if you're actually to move forward with this analysis to the point where you're allocating the benefits to the various planning regions. But it's a little tougher on the west side because at the point where these seams actually enter the western interconnection, there is no RTO. So the only RTO in the west is CalISO. There is a RTO in Alberta, but it doesn't involve any of these ties. So what do? And I think a lot of people are pretty excited, and we heard about this earlier, the Mountain West Initiative, that it might allow for an RTO to actually extend beyond the ties. But there's at least a little glitch in that at this point. As far as transmission service goes, I think primarily those result from bilateral contracts, long-term PPAs of sort of firm transmission needs to support energy deals. And a lot of the benefits, at least that I've seen from this Transgrid-X project, are things like seasonal diversity, seasonal and geographic arbitrage, reserve sharing, EIM benefits, things that are probably difficult to justify purchasing long-term transmission. So just some thoughts on issues with cost recovery. And then FERC Order 1000, unfortunately, at least from my perspective, FERC didn't really complete the job of ensuring that there was good inter-regional planning and even coordination, which is what the order required. There are inconsistent methods that have been developed in the planning regions for determining benefits and for even determining regional needs, for that matter. We see those throughout WestConnect and NTTG. They have different processes for determining if there's a regional need. WestConnect starts with all the base utility plans, and as you can imagine, those probably already satisfy any reliability or policy needs. So to try and find a solid economic need that, something besides what's in the base plans could support is kind of a tough thing to do. They also didn't require any kind of coordination or planning across the interconnects. So I think those are a couple of things that would be helpful moving forward, and I know a lot of people are thinking, well, what are the next steps for this process? I realize there's a lot of additional study work, a lot of refinement, a lot of sensitivity studies, but from what I've seen anyway, there are certainly significant benefits to this project. So I think anything that any of us can do to increase the regionalization of the West would be helpful. And California has been trying to do some things along these lines for several years now, but there are significant issues within each state that might be part of this regionalization, being very reluctant to give up any kind of control. California is reluctant to give up their control over their implementation of all the RPS and greenhouse gas goals. The other states are leery of being allocated costs of transmission that might help California achieve their goals, but also having sort of the California policies migrate into their state requirements. So there's a lot of issues, and it's a very, very difficult thing. But there have been a number of studies, both regionally, CalISO, Pacific Corps initiated some study work, and they all point to significant economic benefit of regionalization of the West. And there's no doubt that regionalization would facilitate the integration of variable renewable resources. So I think anything that we can do to sort of facilitate regionalization in the Western Interconnection would be a good thing. And then the other thing would be joint planning, and I realize, Aaron, that you've got all these entities as part of your team, but I think if it could actually, if the study work could actually transition into a joint effort between WEC or some kind of regional entity within the West, and then the MISO and SPP and PJM, you might get a little further down the road of allocating benefits and that kind of thing. So along those, to kind of further that, I could see where it might be helpful for FERC to require more consistent planning and coordination between the regions, more consistent methodologies, more consistent ways of defining benefits, of allocating those benefits, and then also actually requiring planning and coordination between the interconnections. Thanks.
Thank you. We're talking about going big, aren't we?
Going big.
You may put it on the slide thing here.
Yeah, right there. Hey, thanks, Will. Everybody hear me okay? Okay, I'm not confined to a small space very easily, so I'm going to move around a little bit. What the symposium, as it finishes up here today, leaves us with a question, what's next? Okay, how do we achieve the big benefits that the SEAM-STEX and SEAM study has shown us in the big effort that's happened over the past couple of years? Our team has been working on that question for a couple of years now, starting even before that with initial discussions with Dale Osborne, the godfather of the macro grid, as we've heard here today, and with others, including NREL and Aaron Bloom and his staff and encouragement. And it's called the Power from the Prairie Project and its concept development study. What we're after is developing a model where projects like this can start and can come together in federations of the willing, okay, without the need for a regional organization yet of the Western grid, without a federal consensus of what needs to be done. What can we be doing in the meantime? So we're pleased to be here to tell you about that. Power from the Prairie LLC, we're incorporated in the state of Iowa, and we're an incubator for HVDC transmission projects. We started thinking about this 2 years ago in terms of, okay, what would we do if we started from scratch, which we are, and actually getting some of these elements of the SEAM study to actually happen. We're not a transmission or renewables owner by intent. That is, we would not benefit from the outcome of the studies that we would do. Instead, we're a source of due diligence on studies where the participants in the study can then determine for themselves whether they want to proceed with a project like that. Okay, so we don't have a self-made interest. We're background is resource planning, background is transmission generation planning, cost recovery, regulatory affairs, legislative affairs, those types of things, all the types of things that go into a project like this. So we see that modeling needs to be done in projects like this, but also all the other things that would be involved in actually getting a project to happen in its completeness, and that we've taken that path. Some lessons we've already learned in the process of the past couple of years. Our approach is we have a system up here, but it's a process, a solution that includes modeling, it includes the technical side, it includes the business side, it includes what's the state's roles in this, how early do you get them involved in the process. They have a stake in this. We saw the economic development of the job study earlier today. Said the states should have a self-interest, talk about a burning platform of partnership with the states early rather than coming to them late in your project and asking them for a permit. They should be involved much more earlier in the front end. From a cost recovery perspective, these projects will probably look more like a natural gas pipeline than a state regulatory retail cost recovery approach. It is primarily a business development undertaking, not a transmission project. Okay? It's hard for someone with a couple of electrical engineering degrees to say. Okay? When you hammer, everything else looks like a nail, right? But this is much more challenged on the business side and the geopolitical side in getting these things to happen than necessarily the DC technology that's involved, or even the modeling. And we suggest the project should be led by federations of the willing, of utilities, independent power producers, developers, and the states together in order to investigate these, because they all have a role to play, and they all have very diverse driving forces, very diverse value systems that all have to be honored in order to have something this big, this global, this grand to happen. First project that I'll show you a bit was featured in Power Engineering Magazine's January edition of this past year. It was based on a paper. Fred Fletcher is my partner here in Power from the Prairie, former recently retired Assistant General Manager of Power Supply for Burbank Water and Power in California. He's a California and the anchor of what we're doing. And we did a paper at Power Gen International in Las Vegas in December, and it ended up in Power Engineering Magazine. Here's the concept. Okay, it starts in the west. It starts with a large wind field in Wyoming. Now, this isn't part of our Power from the Prairie project. I'm just giving you background and how this relates. Starts with say a 3,000 megawatt wind field in southern Wyoming. Okay, this could be the Anschutz wind field. This could be the Range, formerly called Pathfinder wind field, okay, in southwest Wyoming, proposed. Then a HVDC line from Wyoming to Delta, Utah, where that red star is, okay, 500 miles worth. And this could be the Duke ATC, American Transmission Company, Zephyr line, or it could be the Transwest Express line by Anschutz. Okay. Chris Jones from Duke Energy is here today. Give him a wave, Chris. Thanks for coming and representing the Zephyr line. Okay. There at Delta, Utah is a 1,900 megawatt coal-fired plant called the Intermountain Power Project, scheduled to be retired in 2025. Okay. Tomorrow in utility terms. Okay. What to do to replace this 1,900 megawatt baseload coal plant where most of its output serves municipals, utilities in Southern California, Los Angeles, my client Burbank, Riverside, Glendale, those folks at baseload. Okay. 7 years away. Okay. What we've proposed, and with Fred's leadership when he was at Burbank, is an option where you take 3,000 megawatts of wind in Wyoming over HVDC to Delta, Utah, have, say, 1,200 megawatts of compressed air energy storage case at Delta, Utah. There's 300 megawatts of wind already near Delta, and then the 2,400 megawatt existing Southern Transmission System HVDC line to Los Angeles and Burbank and Glendale. And there awaiting you is in tiny, that is the duck curve. Okay. And how do you get 3,300 megawatts of wind down a 2,400 megawatt DC line to Los Angeles? That's what the storage is about. You clip the peaks of the renewables of the wind. Rather than peaking with customer load, you peak with the wind, and then you stuff it down this 2,400 megawatt. Our modeling gets this line up to, say, 75-80% capacity factor with wind when you've got storage. Even though the Wyoming wind might be 50% capacity factor, 55 by itself. That's what the storage is. And here, what we've seen, and I'm doing, working on the integrated resource plan for Burbank, all of the municipal utilities in California have to issue an IRP report for the first time to the state of California early next year. So everybody's doing their modeling at the same time. 50% RPS by 2030, potentially going to 60% in 2030 if the bill that's currently in the assembly passes. Okay. What happens then when you look at your models and the output, and I've been doing production modeling for a long time, is pretty eye-popping. If you've got a 50% RPS and you're doing it mostly with solar, as they plan to do, that means they have to have installed renewable capacity that exceeds their annual peak demand. And it's running every day. So every day when the sun is out, through the rest of the year, they're over-generating. And over-generating big. The model shows, and we'll sell it off, the excess from whatever's above our load, we'll sell it off. Okay, you're selling it off. But his model looks the same as yours. He's selling it off, and he's selling it off, and he's selling it off, all at the same time. Okay, what are you going to do with that overproduction? And it's coming, and it's going to be very large. Okay, that's part of the picture here. Do you send it back up the line, back toward Wyoming? You have to spill the electrons out in the ground, right? There's no load out there. Okay, so that's part of the story, and it starts in the west. Let's go to the east. There's also proposed transmission lines going from the wind fields of Iowa toward Chicago and PJM and Easterly. Okay, this could be the Rock Island Clean Line or the project that Trey Ward's going to tell us about, the Sioux Green project. Okay, again, wind to load in the west. Wind to load. Okay, so Fred and I, who are natives of South Dakota, okay, we look at this graph and go, what's missing? Okay. And everything we ever needed to learn, we learned in kindergarten, we connect the dots, okay? So everyone all together, suppose you had a 4,000 megawatt DC line, and you connected the dots between Wyoming and Iowa. Suppose you had a DC, AC, DC converter station in the middle, that's the yellow circle in the middle, where thousands of megawatts of additional new wind energy could be developed. Right there in the very heart of the wind speed map, that's currently landlocked without access to markets because it doesn't have transmission. Suppose it, going from Wyoming to Iowa, it spans the western to eastern interconnection, a la the SEAM study. And in the process, what happens is now you don't just have wind to load happening per the SEAM study, you have bidirectionality. Okay? The energy from the west can go east to load. The energy from the east can go conversely go to the west. So solar overproduction, when it's worthless, coming out of Southern California, has a place to go. And they want, say, 100% renewable energy goals, okay, like Los Angeles does. They get renewable energy back at night when the sun goes down. Okay, so build all you want, California, okay, to say it simply. Build all you want, California. Overproduce, California. There's a place for that to go, and we'll help you get back to your 100% renewable energy goal with renewables that comes back from another direction. Virtual storage, if you will. Okay. Didn't really store it, but that's how it works. And finally, right there on the chart is the site of the Gregory County Pumped Hydro Storage Project in South Dakota. According to the Corps of Engineers, the best place to put a pumped storage unit on the Missouri River, 700 feet of head. And Missouri River Energy Services, a power agency in Sioux Falls representing 60 municipal utilities in 4 states, has filed for a preliminary permit for FERC for that site and has done other work on that. And Ray Wall from Mo River is here. So thanks for coming, Ray. So that's the Power from the Prairie project. Why Power from the Prairie? Well, those very same things that for the SEAM study, what the benefits are. Lower costs for electric customers, at least we're out to show if that's true or not. Opportunity for transmission investment for those who are interested in it. Okay, so this is now the diversity. Some people may not be interested in transmission investment, but they're interested in lower costs for customers. Others may be interested in transmission investment. Additional markets for your legacy wind machines and other generation. Increased renewables, lower carbon, of course. A reliable, clean energy-based alternative to replace legacy generation as it is retired. We're not out promoting retirement of coal plants. I'll show you in a little bit. They're all getting old already, okay? They're going to age out. What are we going to do? Enable daily swaps between Chicago and us place and economic development. If you look at the ages of the coal plants in the region of Power from the Prairie, they're already 35 to 50 years old. So when the SEAM study shows big retirements of coal plants, they're already aging. The plant I helped permit, Sherco 3, operate 800 megawatts operating in Minnesota right now. It's 31 years old already. Okay. They haven't announced its retirement yet, but they're going to get there. An ominous result of the SEAM study for us, for South Dakota natives, is if you look in the center of the chart, and maybe this is an older one, the SEAM study used current transmission and renewables policies as a basis for its development. So as a result, and other factors, there's a big gap in the middle of the development for renewables in South Dakota and Nebraska. Okay. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy that there's little or no development there in the SEAM study because there hasn't been much activity there. Our activities would reverse that. We would say, okay, what if you had a policy to build across South Dakota or Nebraska? Okay. What are the cost outcomes and can you do it? South Dakota has been working on the idea of exporting wind energy for quite a while. Here's a legislative briefing from 2007, 11 years ago. It talks about to increase our energy exports, we need transmission access to markets. My brother Richard and I are familiar with this because we wrote it for the South Dakota Energy Infrastructure Authority years ago. The state of South Dakota more recently is realizing the potential value of energy exports. Here's Governor Dugard in his newsletter. We can deliver more of South Dakota's wind resource to high demand areas just as we deliver other commodities like soybeans and corn to other parts of the nation. Typically people say, oh, there isn't anything in South Dakota, there's no load, why would you build anything there? Well, they can't eat all the corn and soybeans they produce either. We've developed a concept development study which would give entities interested in doing a project like this initial data to show them whether this is a good idea or not. Okay, under the premise that one person in any meeting who has a number is better than 10 people who don't have a number. Okay, we're out to produce some numbers for various entities to say, this is potentially a good idea, this is a good start, and get them started. Task one would be modeling. It would be done by ABB Incorporated. Dr. Jinjiang Zhu, who did our modeling for the Utah Case project and Wyoming Wind. He is the lead consultant to WEC for their grid view modeling studies. So he knows how to do this stuff. He determined the changes in production costs, renewables, transmission flows, all the kinds of things we see in the SEAM study. Not as elegant as that, but that's not the level we really need for this. And we're going to determine the impacts for the total project, and as an extension of the SEAM study, the conceptual total results of the SEAM study, we'll have the results by utility. So we will know what the value and the changes are of production costs and generating plant operations by utility, not just for the utilities who may participate in the study, but they will also know the results for others, utilities who don't participate in the study. So after our study, they'll know who do they go to market to if this turns out to be a good idea. They know whose door to knock on because they know from the study results. We also, the staffs, planning staffs of SPP, thank you, Jay, and MISO, John Lawhorn, thank you for being willing and interested in assisting the effort. Task one, here's the modeling, simple version. What ABB will do is they will take the standard models of WEC, of SPP, of MISO, and of PJM, and to use a technical term, stitch them together. And populate them with the correctly time-diversified renewable energy hourly patterns, where you get the right diversity across the length of the transmission line, and to have the right diversity of loads across the transmission line. So that'll be the base case. Then in scenario A, we will add the western transmission pattern that we showed you from Wyoming to Delta, Utah to Southern California, and we'll determine the value of that compared to the base case. We already know what that answer is because we did it earlier, but we needed this base information for what happens when we add power from the prairie. On the east end, we'll do the same thing for lines that look, a line that looks a lot like the Rock Island Clean Line or a lot like the Sioux Green project. So we'll be determining the value of those projects and to whom. Again, compared to the base case. They will know their costs, but we will know their value. Then in scenario B, we add power from the prairie with additional wind generation in South Dakota and Nebraska. Scenario C, we add Gregory County to see if there's incremental value in addition to the value of the transmission line by adding pumped hydro to it and additional renewables that the pumped hydro will enable. And in scenario D, we will add the compressed air energy storage in Utah. Interesting about storage, we're very bombarded with battery stories in the news these days. And I saw a report by GTM Research that said the United States led the world in stationary battery installations during 2017. 431 megawatt hours of storage. 431. Gregory County, for example, by itself would be 31,000 megawatt hours of storage. So try that with a battery. Task 2, we'll look at the technology. We'll go beyond the economic modeling. We'll look at the technology for DC that we use, the definition of market structure options for operating an interregional DC line, relationship to the regional ISOs and RTOs, automation of line operations and accounting. Is this a blockchain technology candidate? Thousands of wind machines, 3 different markets, established contracts for bidding and settling and procedures, and cybersecurity, as was mentioned earlier. Task 3 will include organization and policy. How do you organize something like this? Is this an LLC? Is it an S-Corp? Nick Critelli of Critelli Law in Des Moines, former president of the Iowa Bar Association, expert in public due diligence examinations, will be doing that piece of it. And also organization and policy, FERC, county and local governance, cost recovery, eminent domain. Ingrid Bjorklund from St. Paul, she's energy attorney, energy law professor there. And study management, I get to be the sheepdog, make sure that everything happens on time. We do have some CDS documents that's been developed. They're utility scale. We have a statement of work that describes what's going to be done, and we have a participant agreement, which we've negotiated with various utilities in the upper Midwest and washed through utility law departments, so we have the document stuff in place. Our CDS schedule would start in September, and 6 months later would be completed in first quarter of 2019. We're not funded by DOE, so we won't need a review by DOE. I warned Aaron Bloom not to react at that moment about that fact. So our participants will have the results, and the general results of the study will be available publicly, but they will retain rights to the detailed results for individual utilities. We learned about the utility, not the utility, but the CDS participants, what characteristics we're looking for a study like this to participate in our study. They have to be progressive, obviously, with ability to innovate. Interest in high levels of renewables. Ability to think beyond their own territory. Ability to think about exporting. Okay? And then you think about various entities, utilities, or whatever. These are various screens they need to pass through, and some of these catch them. Maybe some aren't interested in exporting. Okay? They're taking care of their own business at home. Maybe some of them, as we found out, they're fretting about what renewables are already doing to their coal plants. But they don't yet have an answer for what they would do to replace them. They might have an interest in transmission or renewables investment. They may be anticipating age out of their legacy fossil plants, or just worrying about that and don't know what to do about it. And they need relative freedom from state rate regulatory parochialism. We had some utilities who responded, we don't think our states would allow us to participate in this because it's outside of our state and they want you to build everything inside the state. So that kind of opts out people. So any of you who want to do a project, these are the kinds of things you're going to have to deal with because we already have. We've just been there first. We have 2 CDS participants, Missouri River and Duke American Transmission Company. We're looking for one more. Perhaps someone in this room would be interested in being a participant in this project. We'll take 1 or 2 more, and if you're interested in that, let's talk. So a vanguard effort in realizing the SEAMS benefits. We're project and utility specific. We believe the best business approach is federations of the willing, at least initially, in lieu of having an organized Western market, in lieu of having a cohesive federal energy policy. This can be done with small groups of states and small groups of participants that are project specific. And once built, our multi-region model can be used for other similar studies around the country. That's it. I'm happy to answer or field your questions when we get to the end here. So thanks, Will. Thank you.
My name is Trey Ward. I am manager of the Sioux Green Renewable Rail Project, which I'm very happy to share with you today. This is the first time we've publicly presented it. We've kept it under wraps. As you'll see in a moment, we have our land to begin with. So a lot of the hoopla that would start off a project normally, we haven't had to go through. So we've been quietly in a workmanlike manner developing our project and bringing it to now where it's really the time to enter beyond. So as I was saying, this is our first time to publicly present the project, and you can tell. So to harken back before we go into the presentation, when they were building out the internet in the 90s, they had a somewhat similar issue in that they needed to deploy fiber optic on a national basis very quickly. And so for the siting, they went to the railroads and built out along the railroads where we have the extensive dark fiber network, 100,000s of miles of it across the U.S. And so what we're essentially doing is copying that fiber optic rail co-location model. Oh, there we go, this helps too. So as you see here, this is a map of Iowa and Illinois. And so we will be sending that Iowa wind energy to Illinois. There's currently a 4,000 megawatt build out in the Iowa and southern Minnesota area. So it looks a little bit like CREZ. It looks like in Texas before the CREZ projects when they had all the congestion from wind and prices are going negative. So you can already see the curtailments that are going to be coming online. And Mid-America says they want to go to 100% renewable energy. So you're going to reach a saturation point that without export projects, you're not going to be able to build any more wind here in Iowa. And so we would take that. Now, a distinction between us and a lot of projects is that we will be grid tied in MISO at a point which I'll show you the convergence of MVP projects. So we can draw from a very large resource area and bring grid benefits as opposed to just carrying wind only, where you're subject to the capacity factors of the wind. I'll go into our economic model, but that's very important because you have a higher line utilization. And so we'll be able to carry that wind across the Mississippi River, across the MISO PJM seam, into the state of Illinois, which is a fully deregulated energy state, into PJM, which is the world's largest liquid energy market. So Mr. Lawhorn told us earlier that SPP and MISO are very similar, but MISO and PJM are very dissimilar. So you have the opportunity to arbitrage across that market seam and transmit that energy to Chicago and points east on the 765 kV system. So our project specs are 525 kV, 2100 megawatt VSC system. It's 349 miles, 99% of it would be underground, and at least 85% of it will be co-located along an active railroad right-of-way. My partner is Canadian Pacific Railway, which is one of the Class 1 railroads in the United States. We formed a partnership in 2008. We were trying to do an overhead project in the railroad right-of-way for about 5 years that would go through Wisconsin. I have to admit, I always wondered about what happens when the train derails and hits the pole. So I was looking at poles that could be put back up very quickly, but that always did worry me. In 2012, the railroad said it's got to go underground. And that's when this became a technology story, as I'll talk about with the underground technology advancements. But our timeline in the glacial world of transmission development, we're on a rocket ship. You got 3.5 years of development, 3 years of construction, in service 2025. So based on our discussions with the relevant agencies, we believe the permitting can be done itself in 18 months, but you've got to prepare for it and have some cleanup afterwards. So this is a better map that you can see. This is a map of CP's upper Midwest rail assets. So this was really the tableau that we had to work with. And we knew that we wanted to get around the congestion that is Chicago. You can go north, which we tried to do for a while, or you can go south. And so when we were told in 2012 we had to go underground, every mile counts. And the closest path was the one you see, the dark green line, which the project would start in northern Iowa outside Mason City. And it would go, again, along the Mississippi River, and into the ComEd zone where it will connect at the Plano substation. I think we're very lucky that this is a low volume segment of rail. In Iowa, you only have 2 trains per day, so it's not something that we will run into a lot of high volume rail as we would in the north, where you had 15 trains per hour carrying all that Bakken oil. So it's a first case to do. We want to build a replicable model, and in order to do that, it'll have a good test bed with a low volume rail. And when we go into the Mississippi River, we'll bore. So we'll not go over the Mississippi River. So crossing the MISO PJM market seam creates significant value. It allows the shippers to arbitrage price differences between the 2 markets, the energy, the capacity, and the RECs. So we are a merchant project which is privately financed on the basis of long-term shipper contracts. Those shippers then would arbitrage that value between the seam. So it's a very simple model in theory. Of course, again, with that build out that you can see happening, then that's going to keep that arbitrage value significant over the course of the project. So the real estate, this is a real estate story. Most merchant HVDC projects get hung up on the real estate. Here, this is probably not a fair comparison. These are not DC lines, but you're looking at a minimum for an overhead of 100-foot wide right-of-way. In our case, you're looking at a 5-foot deep, 2.5-foot wide trench that is covered up. And I think there's this trench diagram speaks volumes about the project, because everything that we're doing is a logistical exercise to work along an active railway. So if you're going to replicate this project, it has to be something that can work along all segments of railway, not one where you're just lucky enough to be able to put some poles because it's a relatively rural, low-volume segment. So what we will do is actually we'll dig with conventional trenching equipment, backhoes, and lay 2 PVC pipes, cover it up, and then cap it at the ends, and then as the cable splices come in and we have work blocks, then we'll be able to pull the cable and then splice it at a later time, is our objective. So I think it's very important to point out here that going underground, it avoids the siding issues. Obviously, the public opposition goes away. We do not require eminent domain. I think that's obviously very important because they have outlawed, or it's against, they cannot grant eminent domain rights here in Iowa now to overhead merchant transmission projects. So you still can with underground. We're not seeking eminent domain, but it's obviously an issue. And we want to respect landowner rights in Iowa and Illinois. So, but it also avoids viewshed and environmental impacts. Which brings us to the permitting, and what are the 2 things that regulators might ask a transmission project to do that you'd prefer not to do? And one is to go underground, and the other is to go in a transportation right-of-way. We do both. When we visited with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Army Corps of Engineers at the end of the meeting, they said to us, this is exactly the way that we believe infrastructure should be responsibly built in the U.S. So we anticipate we've gone through with them every single deed along the route and that we own in fee simple. So even though we may appear to come close to the refuge, we stay on private land the entire route. On the interconnection side, again, a differentiator is we're going from a strong node to a strong node. Being grid tied does bring that high line utilization, the system benefits, but it also gives us a large resource area. Anyone who has commercial transportation to our hub, if they're in southern Minnesota, if they're in Iowa, or anywhere, can come onto our line. So we ultimately see that as being a big differentiator because we're not subject to the capacity factors of the wind. And of course, where we land at Plano is the westernmost point of the 765 kV system. So Siemens is our exclusive technology supplier. I'm joined today by Orestes Macchione, who came with me from Raleigh, North Carolina. Siemens will be supplying our HVDC converters. And so what we're doing is very similar in design to the ENELF project in Spain, which is also, I believe, 500 kV, but at 2,000 megawatts. So we're just slightly larger than that. And was also mentioned earlier, don't take my word for it, they're doing similar projects in Germany. The one that I have focused on and working closely with Tenant, which is a Dutch utility that owns a system in Germany. And they are looking to get from the North Sea all of that offshore wind power down to the Bavarian manufacturing centers. And it's almost the exact same design. It's 525 kV, 2,000 megawatts. And the beauty of it is the German government has just paid for the PQ testing with 5 qualified cable manufacturers, so we don't have to. So that's something in real time that they are just now finishing up successfully and validates the technical model. So, and I think before I leave that, just the policy plug here would be that if we wanted to replicate these in the US, don't seek to subsidize projects, but subsidize the building of cable plants at strategic points along the rail here in the US. Right now, I mentioned there's the 5 qualified manufacturers in Europe, there's 7 globally, there's only 1 cable plant in the US that could make this equipment at the cable, and they currently have not made any. So that would be a great way, as if you could build these plants, and that's something that would bring the cost down on the cable, bring jobs, and be able to expedite and expand this model. So again, on the construction side, the hardest part of any transmission project is the path between point A and point B. We know that from the beginning, so we've been able to ride the entire rail at 5 miles an hour with your friends from Power Engineers, Ecology and Environment, the rail master from CP, and our development team, and Jingoli Power. And so therefore we have great cost certainty that you would expect in a project at this stage of the development, because we know where every splice starts and every splice stops. So we believe we have an over 90% degree of cost certainty on it. And none of that takes into account that there will be innovation. Again, I said we plan on and budgeted using backhoes and conventional construction technology, but there will be innovation that we'll be able to perhaps trench along the rail. I don't think we could lay the cable in, but there's no reason you couldn't be able to trench it, and those would be a lot of innovation, having working crews that would stay on sleeping cars in very rural areas and kind of make it fun for them. You could even have dining cars and things like that. And so really the things that we do here and that we learn will be able to be transferred to other projects, and we look forward to sharing our knowledge. So we've built out, I think, a very good team of suppliers and vendors in this who are shown here, but foremost is Siemens, who's been a fantastic partner and given us a lot of support. So that's our project.
Well, pretty exciting stuff. Can anyone hear me? Okay. Well, this is great. And if this conference achieves nothing else, it has achieved getting Trey, who lives in Raleigh, North Carolina, to get to know Bob, who lives in Raleigh, North Carolina, and so they now know about each other's projects.
Only in Iowa.
That's right. Well, we can go right to questions if you got them. Questions? Yes, sir.
Short question. Voltage source converter, 525 kV?
Yes.
Charlie.
Would you like to know why it's a VSC system?
Okay.
Is because you can use the XLPE cable, and that's really what enables this project and the technology, is to be able to use that XLPE.
Grab the mic.
So if you're using a classic HVDC system, no? I know. Can you hear me now?
I know what the term hot mic means now. The mic's got to warm up, I guess. So using a classic HVD system, you would have to use MI cable, which is larger, it's unwieldy, and there's only probably a handful of people, and they're mostly Italian, who can splice it together. And so the moonshot, if you're doing these long underground projects, is the splicing, and the XLPE cable is really what enables it. It's perfect, it handles vibrations easily, easy to handle in the field, and it's more lightweight, you can get longer reels, so that's the differentiator in the model. And these are things that are just happening in real time, that the cable, the transfer capacity is increasing and the price is falling rapidly.
So I have a general question for the panel. Looking at the MISO MVP projects, and there was a big plan that was developed initially, and sort of as opportunities came up, I think the lines were put together link by link at a time. And I'm wondering if there's any kind of a similar development opportunity for the macro grid that we talked about today, whether there's any pieces of this or any thought that's been given, or maybe you'd like to give some thought to looking at the bigger macro grid and see whether any of these projects fit into that, whether there's an opportunity to get this thing started, you know, before everything is all decided and all planned out.
Yeah, thanks. I'll take that one. When you look at the MVP project and the projects and the definition of them, that is that they meet multiple policy guidelines, and usually that enables renewable energy, and that the basic premise behind it is, in terms of cost recovery, that you spread the costs across a larger footprint than say traditional rate making for transmission, which basically charges wherever the poles are, charges those customers where the transmission is, and this may not be benefiting at all the people where the poles are. So we think, in addition to potential for following a gas pipeline model, that an MVP type of approach that exists now in MISO, there's a similar name for it in PJM, has potential applications, because what you'd be doing here is enabling renewable energy and over long distances, which probably suggests cost recovery in our mind over a much wider footprint than just the locals, that concept fits pretty well, we think, in addition to, say, using more of a producer pays gas pipeline type of model. So we think there's real potential there, but we haven't done much more work on it other than say, oh, that concept might fit.
Other questions? Larry, that was hotter than this one. You have to really.
So this is for Trey. You talked about, hopefully people can hear me, you talked about needing help with manufacturing the cable, or incentives for companies that could manufacture the cable here. Besides that, what barriers are you worried about? So you've got you talked about all the ducks you have lined up, but what are the things that keep you up at night? What are you still worried about with the project?
Well, you always want to find customers in a merchant project. That is job number one, because this is privately financed.
I just assumed that because there are lots of people looking for transmission through the queues, that customers wouldn't really be an issue. I mean, what they're willing to pay for the transmission capacity,
I share your belief.
And access, yeah, is maybe an issue, but I was looking for a little bit more novel answer than that. I mean, kind of probing a little deeper on what are you concerned about?
Well, I mean, in our sense, we've taken care and checked the boxes of a lot of the things that you worry the most about, which is the public opposition and the siting. So literally, if our numbers work, our project goes. And the studies show that our numbers do work. So a lot of the questions I get are, well, what's the cost of the wind in northern Iowa versus northern Illinois? Is it that different? Does it justify the line? And that's not the way to look at it, because you're separately on the you have one LMP node with a price. And so what we've shown, if you add over time the LMP arbitrage, the capacity, the next thing people say on capacity is always, well, wind only has a 15% capacity factor credit in PJM, but anyone can bid into the capacity market that is within our wingspan. So it could be a natural gas plant, but you stack all those up and the RECs have very little value in MISO, and you add that, and you're looking at a roughly $30 per megawatt hour or in excess of that arbitrage spread, which will support the CapEx of the project. So, but you have to have, it's not just long-term customers, they have to be creditworthy and have the balance sheet to support it. These are all things that are very doable, but they are challenges.
Yeah, Doug Aaron from NREL. I'm going to follow up in the same vein, which is congratulations to all of you. You all presented a different perspective on, I'll call it integrating systems level perspectives into a new value proposition, and so this is across different generation and the transmission assets, et cetera. What I'd like to get, if you're willing to share, is what are the essences of the conversations you've had around portfolio risk and capital in terms of acquiring the capital for those large projects, and what does that look like in terms of a value proposition to customers? It's a little bit of a kind of an extension of the same question you just had, but it seems to be much more complicated now. And so I guess the question is how are you managing the complication or the complicated nature of the projects that you're now conceiving?
So in our case, our customers are the shippers. And so they have to see the sufficient value, and the project is financed by private capital, which we retained Whitehall and Company. And so they went out to market end of 2017, and I'm on a confidentiality, but we're in the process of closing. So as you can imagine, these are very, very sophisticated global financiers who can put up that kind of cash and stay in a deal for the 6 years that it takes before you're going to see COD. Takes a special type of investor, and as you can imagine, they heavily scrutinize the arbitrage and the likely ability to get customers. And so those customers will then, whether it's Peter or not, someone will actively trade on this line, and that's how you maximize the value of the line. I'm not sure if this answers your question.
Let me just follow up a little bit. So there's a mix of technology that you're bringing in, particularly in your case, it's new technology, and you've taken away the siting and the
Yes.
rights risk, but you still have project development risk, you still have delivery risk, you still have arbitrage risk, all those other pieces in your world, in the prairie to the power from the prairie. I mean, you've got all sorts of other mixed risks, right? And so the question is and likewise, you've got vertically integrated risk. And so the question is, how are you thinking about managing those risks in an increasingly complicated world? And maybe I'll just add one more thing. I've only heard one person talk about kind of an end-use customer, i.e. the utilities in Southern California or other places. Where are the hundreds of companies, the large industrial commercial players who have now committed to, in some sense, 100% renewable energy, if you're thinking about it as an enabler for wind and solar?
Sure.
Where are they in your landscape?
Several questions in there. I think, first off, you approach development risk like an IPP developer of a wind farm or anything else. You take your largest risk off the table first, and you work down. Some of the risks linger, but before you expend more capital, you want to try. And so we will have a staged milestone approach that's very disciplined, because you have to reach that milestone to get the next infusion of cash. So it keeps your focus very much, and I think that's something that works. As far as where, for our purposes, it's very interesting delivering into the deregulated market in Illinois. So I'm from Atlanta originally, practiced law there for 20 years. It's in my DNA, worked with utilities, and we have Southern Company, which is great. But it put it into my DNA. It's better to work, with the local utility than against them. So if there's a way to work with the utilities, absolutely would love to work with them. But understanding that there's a huge untapped corporate market, especially on the mid-size, that can't go build their own Facebook-sized wind farms in Iowa. And so we essentially could treat our converter station in PJM in Illinois as a green hub and do synthetic PPAs essentially on a large scale with a multiplicity of parties. From a financing perspective, you'd rather aggregate that and either have, for instance, a utility who manages that, a commodities trader could manage that, and everything else. So the corporates have in fact, that will probably be, or it is going to be our initial outreaches to REBA and some of the renewable energy buyers groups. But at the foundation, that's to show the utilities that the offtake desire is there, because we'd much rather see the utilities take the capacity.
I think one of the challenges that your question brings about is the difference between physical and financial products. And to date, most of the RE100 buyers who are not building their own wind farms like Facebook are doing financial swaps out of wind farms in Texas. And that has nothing to do with deliverability. It has nothing to do with arbitrage. It's strictly a low price product that demonstrates, additionality, which is very important to them. And obviously these transmission projects create new opportunity for additionality. But right now, every large customer that comes to market, there is a wind developer in Texas willing to build a wind farm to meet that in the low $20 all in. So again, I think it's somewhat apples and oranges. I think to make these wind farms go with transmission, you have to have customers who actually want physical supply, not just financially swapped supply.
And as your question implies, our customer base, the clients we're talking to, largely utilities as well as transmission companies or shippers, is they're looking for an element in their resource portfolio to replace something they've got now. Like a coal plant, for example, might be a high capacity factor coal plant, and they might have either high state-driven RPS requirements, so they got to change that coal plant to something else, and might not be able to be gas or a lot of gas. It's going to have to be renewable. So part of the value proposition is if you can have a long transmission line over several hundred miles, and you can take advantage of several cuts at the same wind pattern that goes by, say from Wyoming to South Dakota to Iowa, you have a much higher availability of wind over a higher period of time. And then you add storage to that, you can get to something for them that can be more of a substitute, kind for kind, for the resource that they're getting rid of. I mean, we're seeing in some of the modeling that we're doing, if you put a combined cycle plant, a new one in California, natural gas-fired combined cycle plant, and you've got a 50% RPS or 60%, that new combined cycle plant will be stranded within its, operationally, within its lifetime. Okay, it's going to be running like 10% of the time capacity factor. Okay, going from something decent in the initial years to something terrible in the later years. So in terms of risking the risk factor, and these gentlemen are more on the financial and market side than we are. But if you're looking at the risk of the off-taker, usually a utility off-taker, that's mitigating the risk of making this transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy and maintaining reliability at the same time, that's a lot of what these types of things are about. Getting the diversity of the renewable resource as reflected in the SEAM study, for example, and as we're working to reflect in our studies, our concept development study, is capturing that diversity and what's that worth. And in our initial look at the patterns of Wyoming wind and Iowa wind, you're getting the same wind pattern that's traveled 25 miles an hour from Wyoming to Iowa. But if you're connected to the ends in the middle of the transmission line, you got access to that wind. You get 3 bites at the apple as the wind's coming across, which provides for greater reliability and thus better on the supply risk side. So that's part of the conversation that we've been having on the physical side of these transactions.
I guess I would introduce just a question for everyone to think about. So if we set California and New England aside, who are 2 jurisdictions that have demonstrated willingness to purchase physical renewables over the long term, and say, how does RPS look in the rest of the country? Well, it looks like an intention, And in the cases of utilities like Berkshire Hathaway and other utilities that can rate base it, it looks like very serious business. But if we look at the rest of the markets, particularly at PJM and MISO, certainly in ERCOT, and we say, what happens if natural gas prices are 50% of what they are today? So $1.50 future MMBTU natural gas prices. How does that change investment decisions? And then we say, what if natural gas prices are twice what they are today, $6? And I think the dynamic quality of how these jurisdictions will make renewable and investment decisions is vastly different under those two scenarios. And I think what we've seen is a real switch of a lot of the assumptions that we've sort of come into the decade or this since 2000. All of these LNG plants were to receive LNG, and now they've been switched to export LNG, right? We always said natural gas in New York City was always more expensive than natural gas in Texas. Now that's not the case. And so the price of natural gas has an impact on all of these decisions when you kind of roll it back to the utility buyer's perspective. Again, except in those jurisdictions who have really been willing to sort of put their money where their mouth is from a long-term procurement perspective.
Well, with some of the renewables prices we've seen lately, and if I have the risk of volatility, getting back to the question on risk, if I have volatility that gas could be $1.50 or it could be $6, and I can take gas variability out of the question by having renewables at the current prices we're seeing, at $20, $30, then that is a risk hedging mechanism, just to take the natural gas question mark out of the equation. So it's a good point, Peter.
So, is this on? It's been sitting on the whole time, so if it's not working, it's... Wow.
You've got to talk to it.
Yeah, maybe. So Trey, question related to some of the specifics of your project, and that's mainly tying into MISO at the western end. Does
Yes.
that presume that the off-takers or the shippers that use your product have to be comfortable with essentially paying two transmission costs, because there'll be a MISO network charge in addition to whatever your charge ends up being, and then presuming you put to PJM, then ultimately the end-use customer then is paying three charges, and does that give you any concern?
You don't have pancaking of rates throughout, but there will be some customers, a IPP wind developer would have to pay MISO to get to our system. There's nothing to stop someone from putting a 345 kV AC line directly into it if a independent developer wanted to have the optionality of shipping on our line. So I think having that optionality is good, but there is not for instance, if Mid-Am, markets are funny things. They find out how ways to make money. If Mid-Am wanted to make a quarter penny and ship wind energy because it has an overabundance, then in that case, they would make the decision to ship, and they're already on the system. And so they would have no transportation costs. So it really depends on who your customer is as well.
So, okay, I'm going to try this. So, Marianne Hatch with EEI, seconding our colleague here. Congratulations to all of you. Very impressive projects, and my mind is blown. My question is for Bob and this Power on the Prairie project. As you connect California potentially all the way over into MISO and PJM, to me it almost seems like a wormhole between the markets. It's pretty cool. And so as I think about the political landscape that exists in PJM and in MISO and California and the interaction between all the states, what kind of sentiments have you observed or do you expect to observe if you do start exchanging power between, say, California and a MISO and California in a PJM? And would there need to be any kind of a shoring up of policies between these kind of coastal markets?
What we believe in what we're doing in California to Chicago, and we're just in the center. We have gentlemen already working the eastern end of it and gentlemen already working the western end of it, is California is in a bit of a conundrum now. They want 100%, a lot of people. They want 100% renewables. But they want it all to be installed in state. So the labor unions, among others, are very strongly want it all to be built in state. So to do that and to address that issue, then they're going to be overproducing, which brings us back to the need for DC lines. Once California engages in a discussion where it's possible for them to do, in our mind, swaps. You can have 100% of very high renewable energy levels, and you can build all you want in California. But if you have the DC system like the SEAM study envisions and like folks here are envisioning, you have a way they can have both, if you will. They can overproduce, and they have a place for that to go, and it goes somewhere else, and they can get back renewable energy from the Midwest when the sun goes down to get to their 100% requirement. And they can do that via bilateral arrangements or other agreements that ensures them that that's not coming from a coal plant. Okay, that they have the RECs, they have the rights to what comes back to them. So they can have all of the solar in California. Okay, I'm speaking grandly here because the devil's in the details, but you can have all that solar in California that you want locally, and you can get to 100% renewables by doing the DC swaps that we envision would happen. And would additional grid level storage be part of that? Maybe, if it turns out to be incrementally better on its own when you add it to the HVDC. So that's part of the grand plan that we read when we see the SEAM study underneath, is it helps get people, say in California, just as one example, off the hook of their current conundrum. I mean, and they're going round and round right now, bless their hearts. I don't know if anyone's here from California other than Fred. Bless their heart, they're going round and round and trying to get this regional Western grid thing together, which is going to take them a long time to do. Meanwhile, people are worried that if they join, they're going to lose power from California to someone else, and they're going to get coal energy back. I mean, that's part of the discussion, and you can bypass that if you just do some of these simple DC links and some contracts back and forth. They can get both ends. So don't know if that's directly responsive. Meanwhile, the folks in, for example, in South Dakota, our native state, are very supportive of what we're doing from economic standpoint. So to have a state in favor of, to have a state office pull out their map of that they own the right-of-ways across most of the state that are abandoned. In South Dakota, it reverts to the state, not to someone else. So they have a lot of abandoned railroad right-of-way across the state, and the rest of the state, the rest of the balance crosses Native American reservations, and the tribes have plans for 1 gigawatt of wind energy and no transmission. Okay. You can read ahead on where that might go. So that's some of the dynamic, but yeah, it's really complicated state to state. Bob?
If I could add a little bit. Yeah, Mary Ann, there's certainly a lot of motivation by various factors in California to ensure that as much of the renewables as possible can be built in state. But we believe, and we have quite a bit of indication, that some of the newer load serving entities, and there's a whole category of what's called community choice aggregators in California, that are going to be willing to take the lowest cost renewable energy, and if that means out-of-state wind bundled with transmission, that we believe they'll be willing to do that. There should be an indication on August 1st, I believe. All of the LSEs in California, including the CCAs, have to sort of declare their local IRPs consistent with the reference plan that the PUC approved, I think late last year or maybe early this year. What we've seen historically is that California was very, very concerned to ensure anything coming in was truly renewable energy. And for the most part, they wanted it, physical delivery, so it had to be either connected to CalISO system or dynamically scheduled into their system. So I think moving forward, you're going to, as long as you can sort of develop the policies and the mechanisms to ensure that it's not the dirty coal from Wyoming that gets there, you can still have resources from outside of California meeting their RPS requirements.
My turn to try to get the mic to work. Okay. David Mindham with ITC. We've talked a little bit about risks relating to siting and some of the other issues that are coming up, and I'm specifically interested in RTO, maybe barriers that RTOs have from making this model kind of work. A few that kind of popped into my head were trying to navigate the interconnection processes in two separate RTOs, maybe PJM pseudo-tie requirements in order to sell the capacity market and visibility, and maybe exposure to RTEP cost assessments for an HVDC line. And I'm wondering if you could specifically comment on any risks, maybe those ones specifically, or other risks that at the RTO levels that may need to change in order for this model to work.
And I guess, well, first of all, which model? So if you're talking about the merchant model and in the context of my project, MISO is currently putting together a very good MHVDC interconnection procedure that is spelling out very clearly what we need to do in MISO. PJM has a history of moving well and moving things along. They have a procedure that's been in place for a good long time, but there will have to be inter-RTO coordination, and there's not much precedent for it on the actual operational level. You know, they've had the IPSAC process, which has not actually resulted so far in any SEAMS projects, but they will be have to work together at some level, and that's probably one of my, it's definitely a concern because it's something that's beyond our control and it's not something they've done before, but I have every confidence that they will. But it's two separate processes entirely.
I will just say, in the case of Neptune and Hudson, both of those are 660 megawatt DC cables, and in both cases, they cannot operate bidirectionally only out of PJM into New York. So the costs for injection into PJM was really prohibitive because of the nature and the congestion in North Jersey. So I think you're raising a very important point, and I think it goes to a lot of what we've discussed, which is if we sort of take a 10,000-foot view, these projects should provide a great deal of benefit because they create a lot of optionality back and forth. But I think in reality, sometimes certain RTOs who really want the transmission will facilitate that, and those who don't see it in their interest can make it very prohibitive.
Time for one more question.
I've got the mic, I get the question. Back to Trey again. On my screen here, I'm looking at the DC link that comes into San Francisco. Siemens built that about 6 years ago. It's maybe 30 to 40 miles underwater coming under the San Francisco Bay there to a site downtown very close to where Candlestick Park used to be. They're coming in by voltage source converter, which is what you're talking about. Because the size of the available land was so little in downtown San Francisco, they could not go with conventional. So they've got a terrific benefit from the size advantage of the voltage source converter. The voltage on that system, again using similar cable, was 200 kV, and you're talking over 500. We've had a big advancement there.
Yes, sir. The 525 kV advancement is huge, and Siemens was talking to the company, Siemens made very clear it's something they could do. They had the precedent for it, and it's a very German thing to say they can do this. And so they've been a fantastic supporting partner from the inception. But we visited Transbay and looking for lessons learned.
Great. Well, thank you to our panelists. Fantastic.